Well, as people coming in, I do want to welcome everybody to this first edition of the Hot Topics for Area 8 here. Area 8 educators came together and decided we wanted to kind of uh, allow or find out what some of those hot topics are across the state, across the county, across everything. And we had a great presentation lined up today, but unfortunately, um, unfortunately, she was sick this morning. And so we had to scramble around. And thankfully, Jessica Outcalt was able to come up with a presentation here that she has on backyard gardening and landscaping for birds. So with that, we are recording this. So if you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and answer or ask them in the chat, and we will get them answered in that time. Before we get started here, I am going to throw up a poll here real quick. And this is completely voluntary. This just kind of allows us to know who we're serving with this offering. So just go ahead and take a few minutes here and go ahead and answer that.
Jump into we will be having an email was sent out. We will have that educator who is talking about ants that has been rescheduled to Monday, January 22nd. So that link should also be available to you, and we'll send that out with our wrap-up email as well.
All right. Well, while those are kind of trickling in, I'm going to go ahead and turn the floor over to Jessica here and allow her to kind of take over. Like I said, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We'll get to them, or if in the middle of it or towards the end. So, Jessica, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thanks, Matthias. Yeah, I am excited to talk about this. Like we said, this was kind of a last minute change. So thank you all for being understanding with that. Luckily, I had a PowerPoint ready to go. So we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to introduce myself really fast for those of you who don't know me. My name's Jessica Outcall. I am the Ag Natural Resources and Community Development Educator. I'm in Cass County, Logansport. I've been in this county since September. I've been with Extension since 2022. Before that, I got my bachelor's degree from Taylor University over in Grant County. And then I went to Purdue for grad school, and I studied wildlife ecology with a focus on bird migration. So I'm a bird person. I love talking about birds. And one of the biggest reasons I love talking about birds is because it's such a great way to connect with people across strata, across all kinds of different socioeconomic backgrounds, different landscapes, different environments, different contexts. So I'm excited to share about kind of some backyard gardening and landscaping kind of tips and tricks with focus on birds. So I'll go ahead and get started. So to kind of introduce why birds matter and why thinking about gardening with a wildlife friendly approach really matters. There was a landmark study that came out in 2019, so only a few years ago, that really quantified how many birds we have lost since 1970 was the time frame. So you know, a lot of our audience might have been born then. A lot of them probably weren't born at that point. So just thinking about how many birds we should have in our environment, we are about 3 billion birds short relative to what you or your parents or your grandparents experienced in the 1960s and 70s. This is about 30% of our birds are missing. One of the biggest reasons for this is habitat loss. So the loss of suitable habitat, whether that's the food resources they need, whether that's the shelter and environment they need, or clean water. Habitat loss is a big reason for some of these declines. Another big reason for some of these declines is predation from non-native predators. So I always tell people the best thing you can do for birds is to keep your domestic cat inside. Domestic cats are the biggest source of predation on birds. So Cats are a big source of mortality. And then climate change is another big hot topic, which I'm not going to get into climate change today. There's lots of research on it. If you search the National Audubon Society, they have a whole page on climate and birds and what we can do, and kind of what the concerns are there. So yeah, thinking about why does this matter? Bird populations across the continent are in decline. And small actions, even on the scale of a single potted plant, can really benefit birds, even in our own backyards. So when we think about wildlife friendly management, I always tell people if you can create diversity, even on a small scale, that's going to be really beneficial. So whatever your goal, if you can aim for having diverse habitats in your landscape, that's going to be awesome. So sometimes when I give this presentation, I give it to audiences who have a lot of forest. So if you fit into that category, if you own any forest land, timber management techniques, silvicultural techniques are really good ways to create some diversity of habitat. Whether that's something as simple as removing a single tree to create a gap in the canopy and provide some structural diversity for birds like the cerulean warbler. Even something like a clear cut can actually have beneficial wildlife effects depending on the landscape needs, depending on how the clear cut is done. When clear cuts regenerate after a cut, that dense shrubby area is full of food resources for birds. It's full of, so and I mean clear cut, I mean just cutting a whole area. And that could be small, like half an acre, it could be multiple acres. So just cutting everything down to the ground. Sometimes foresters will leave snags standing, which can provide habitat for woodpeckers. But essentially you're cutting a whole area instead of a single tree or a few trees. And when that forest begins to regrow after that disturbance, then you get a lot of kind of dense shrubby areas, and those dense shrubs are really beneficial for a lot of birds because it provides that food and shelter that they need. So I just want to kind of mention that timber management sometimes gets a bad reputation, but it can have some beneficial impacts on bird populations. Again, depending on the landscape context. I'll save some time at the end for questions if we want to talk more about timber management. And I'm going to provide some resources on that. So if that's something you're interested in, please let me know. And I'll be sure to leave some time at the end for questions. And then what I really want to focus on today is backyard gardening, because most people have a backyard, or even, a balcony off their apartment. You can put a plant outside in a pot. So this kind of backyard gardening from, again, a single pot, a single like raised bed, all the way up to, an entire backyard that's been converted into a grass-free area. Those can provide habitat for birds and fulfill needs. So I'm going to kind of dive into what that looks like. So when I talk about birds, bird is a very general category. This can be everything from, the pretty little songbirds that sing at your feeder, something like a sparrow, or my toddler's current favorite, a cardinal. She loves the bright red birds right now. Any book I have that has a cardinal, she goes crazy for it. So it could be anything from a cardinal up to, the giant national bird of the country, the bald eagle, which is a predator and scavenger. So birds have unique ecological niches across some of these strata. My PowerPoint is being slow. There we go. So birds can be predators. I can mention something like an owl, something like a hawk. Even blue jays are predators. Blue jays are nest predators primarily, so they'll go and prey on eggs of other small birds. Birds can also be prey. So a lot of birds can be prey for bigger birds, or prey for other predators, whether that's small mammals like raccoons and skunks, or larger mammals like coyotes and wolves, depending on what part of the country you're in. Birds are also pest control. So this picture, it's a European robin, but it was a stock image, so it was free. Birds are insectivores. A lot of birds are, not all birds, but especially during the breeding season, newly hatched birds need a lot of protein to grow. And that protein typically comes in the form of small, soft-bodied caterpillars. So during the breeding season, having access to a large amount of small caterpillars or worms is vital for so many birds in this part of the country. And that can turn into pest control because a lot of times those small caterpillars are things that like vegetable gardeners don't want to see, that forest managers don't want to see. So birds can help keep those populations in check. We have aerial insectivores as well, like the whippoorwill, like the nighthawk, and they catch insects like mosquitoes. So another beneficial effect for humans is we can cut down on mosquito populations by having a lot of birds around. Birds are also pollinators. So birds in tropical areas, you tend to see a huge amount of hummingbirds and honey eaters and things like that. In areas where there are a lot of very unique and diverse flowers. In the Midwest, we have some birds that pollinate. Hummingbirds and orioles are typically the birds that will pollinate flowers. And so this can be really beneficial if your goal is having fruit and having some of those really pretty flowers that hummingbirds tend to like trumpet vine. And then birds are also seed dispersers. So most songbirds are either insectivores or granivores, which means they eat seeds, or they're both. And a lot of birds that eat seeds tend to consume fruit that has the seeds in them, and then they go and poop it out later. So this turns into seed dispersal. So it helps the plant spread its genetics across the landscape and grow and become more prevalent on the landscape. Again, depending on which plants you're talking about, this could get into issues of invasive species being transported across the landscape, but this is a role that birds have in the environment as they disperse seeds of different kinds of plants. So when we look at some of these different niches, we can look at habitat management that benefits those different niches. So something like an eastern screech owl, it needs a old dead limb or an entire dead tree to provide a nesting spot. So they nest in holes in snags. You can also put out boxes that are designed for eastern screech owls. So thinking about that habitat aspect, you can create habitat for something like an eastern screech owl just with a single tree in your backyard. Birds are also prey. So this habitat is the habitat of the yellow-breasted chat, which is similar to a warbler. They're small songbirds. They really like to eat a lot of berries. And so they tend to really like some of this dense shrubby area, which also provides shelter from predators. So they nest, very deep in some of these dense shrubs where predators can't get to them. So providing some of those native shrubs like serviceberry or dogwood or things like that can benefit birds like the yellow-breasted chat. Birds are also pest control. I mentioned the whippoorwill. They need open areas to forage for their prey because they catch insects while flying. So if you can provide some open habitat and make sure you're not using too many pesticides, using some integrated pest management techniques to really help foster those insect populations, eastern whippoorwills and other insectivores are really going to benefit. Birds are also pollinators. So this is the Baltimore Orioles habitat. They really like having water around because that water provides insects for them. A lot of our insects in this area have aquatic larval stages. So if you have access to water and can manage that well, using, again, integrated pest management, so you're not killing everything in the water or things like that, you can really foster populations of insect-eating birds through providing their food resources. And then birds are also seed dispersers. So the eastern towhee is one that forages on seeds on the ground in forest. So this forest habitat has a lot of shrubs, which provides shelter for them, but then also has some of these open areas on the ground to provide access to those seeds that they'll forage. Eastern towhees are fun because they're little sparrows, but they actually like hop on the ground and scratch. So they kind of hop scratch to find the seeds in the leaf litter. So if you ever hear like rustling in the woods, that's kind of a ch, ch, ch. That might be an eastern towhee foraging for some food. So all of these habitat diagrams, they are an aspect of a project that I did a couple years ago. It was called Forestry for the Birds. I was working with the Nature Conservancy at this point, and we partnered with Purdue Extension and other conservation partners. And we kind of compiled a lot of information about different forest management techniques that really help benefit a lot of birds. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but did want to mention it if anyone's interested in forest management. In Indiana, we have a lot of old forest, which can be really beneficial, and it's benefited a lot of our mature forest birds, like the wood thrush, like the cerulean warbler, some really pretty mature forest specialists. And there's been concern about too much timber harvest. If you go out west, you're going to hear a lot of news stories and kind of controversial issues of clear cutting out in like some of those giant conifer forests, and how that was a really big concern for birds like the spotted owl out in California. So, and that is a valid concern, is, you know, are we harvesting our timber in a way that's sustainable? But with some of those concerns and with emphasis on initiatives like Smokey the Bear that has really cut down on wildfires, our forests tend to not be as disturbed as they used to be historically. So historically, the indigenous people in this area would do a lot of fire to manage their forests. So they created a lot of disturbance, which provided a lot of young forest in some of this shrubby regrowing areas. And so Indiana's landscape doesn't quite look like that anymore. So this raises concerns for those birds that specialize in some of that young forest area. So the Forestry for the Birds project was inspired by a very similar program in Vermont. And that program had a lot of success, and we saw that it could really benefit foresters and landowners in the central hardwoods region, or Indiana, Kentucky, Illinois, that kind of eco region there. So what we did was we selected 12 bird species to kind of give us a nice tidy number. The birder's dozen is what we called it. And we identified 12 birds that would really benefit from forest management. So these are all birds that breed in Indiana, and they're all forest birds. Some prefer more old forest, some prefer young forest, but they all depend on forest in some measure, and they're all going to benefit from forest management. So we came up with this list through discussions with ornithologists, with wildlife biologists, people at Purdue, people at IU, other universities in Indiana, Audubon societies, and other scientists across the state who would be stakeholders in this decision. So this is kind of how we narrowed that list down. So I've kind of broken it down into, we had some mature forest birds. So the wood thrush, the worm-eating warbler, which has this really pretty stripy head. It's called the worm-eating warbler because it eats those soft-bodied caterpillars exclusively. A lot of birds are going to eat those soft-bodied caterpillars, which are really important for wildlife in general. The cerulean warbler, they're sky blue, and they hang out at the very top of the forest canopy. So you rarely see them because they're often, 100 feet high in the air. And then the hooded warbler, which tends to hang out lower in the forest. Often if a tree falls, whether naturally or anthropogenically, you'll often find a hooded warbler in those gaps or hanging out around the downed log or things like that. So these are kind of our mature forest birds. So we also looked at some young forest birds, and these are the ones whose populations are declining quite significantly in Indiana because we've lost some of that young forest, that early successional. When I say succession, I mean that it's an ecological process. So after a disturbance, things regrow, and things regrow in different speeds. So the grass and the shrubs and the forbs are going to regrow fastest, and then create kind of this really dense shrubby habitat. And you're going to get like a tulip poplar, which is a very fast growing tree, coming in and creating this very dense stand of something like tulip poplar. And then you get the slower growing shade benefiting species like oaks and hickories, and then kind of the classic mature forest in this area is a maple beech, which are the slowest growing, and they need a lot of shade to really benefit their growth. So that process from disturbance to mature forest, that's called succession. And so these are the birds that specialize in the forest, within 5 to 10 years after it's been disturbed, whether that's a artificial clear cut, whether that's a fire, whether that's, a tornado going through or something like that. So the Eastern American woodcock, this is a game bird. If you're not familiar with it, it's not as popular of a game species as something like the ruffed grouse, but it's a little more common. We have the yellow-breasted chat, which I've mentioned already, the towhee, which is the sparrow bird with the bright red eye. The Eastern whippoorwill, which you will typically never see in your lifetime. You pretty much only hear them. If you're lucky enough to see them, good job, you have really good eyes. So, because they have this really cool cryptic coloration. So if you can hear a whippoorwill, if anyone's a gamer, the Legend of Zelda game that features the whippoorwill call in it, the Breath of the Wild one. And you'll often hear the whippoorwill call if you're into games. And then the yellow-billed cuckoo, this is another really good one. Yeah, they're really cool young forest birds. You often see cuckoos like along power line corridors, so where you've got that like U-shaped gap in the forest. That can be a really good way to, sorry, excuse me. Sorry, I'm not going to answer my phone right now. Yeah, so cuckoos tend to like those gaps in the forest and that really dense shrubby area. Cuckoos, fun fact, were often called the rain crow because they like to sing on overcast days and often rainy days. So you might hear a cuckoo like when it's kind of dreary and rainy, and that's given it the nickname the rain crow. And then we picked some birds that could fit into some different categories. So the Baltimore Oriole is one that's a really common feeder bird. So you'll often see this at bird feeders, especially during the spring when they're on migration or coming to find a new breeding habitat. The Eastern Screech Owl, we wanted to include a predator on that list, and something that would be really fun for a lot of people to try and bring into their own habitat. And then the red-headed woodpecker, which is one of our poster children. It's a gorgeous woodpecker if you get the chance to see it. And it thrives in open oak woodlands. So where you've got a lot of young oak trees, some kind of open areas, maybe some shrubs, some grasses. Yeah, because they tend to forage on dead wood. So if you can leave a snag if you're doing forest management practices, or they're also aerial insectivores. Most woodpeckers will actually dig and bore for wood boring insects. The red-headed woodpecker also catches birds or insects while flying. So if you can provide open areas for it to catch some of those insects, you get to see a really cool behavior of a woodpecker, which typically you associate with, pecking on dead wood. So all of this kind of came into our final production, which was Forestry for the Birds. So the website is nature.org/Indiana Forests. If you go to that website, you'll find the pocket guide we were able to put together, So this provides information on, some natural history about the birds. So some of their behavior, some of their natural history. The PDF on the website has clickable audio, so you can go and play their songs as well. And then it also provides information that can help you manage your property for some of those birds. So the whippoorwill tends to like young forests. So what are some of those techniques that you can use to create young forest in your landscape? If you're really into forestry, we also produced a silvicultural guide. So this one is much more in-depth, designed for professionals, professional foresters, land managers who really want to dive into some of these practices. And what I love about this guide is it connects with NRCS programs. So if you are involved in any conservation programs like the Conservation Reserve Program or a classified forest or anything like that, the silvicultural guide provides information on techniques that would qualify under some of those programs and benefit birds. So again, I'm not sure if I have any forestry professionals on this call, but if you are, I'm biased, but I recommend this guide. So yeah, and then we've also been publishing a profile of each bird in the Woodland Steward, which is a quarterly newsletter that's sent out to forest landowners in Indiana. And so I've been writing profiles of each of the bird species. So my grandpa gets these articles, and every time a new one comes out, he gets so excited, and he always has to show me the newsletter with it. So yeah, they're really fun, just articles, and it's available online. So if you search the Woodland Steward, you can find access to archived versions of the newsletter as well. And then we're also working on, so this is kind of what the profiles look like. We're also working on developing a guide for Illinois that's modeled after what we did here in Indiana. And then Purdue Extension, the Forestry and Natural Resources Department, they're also putting together a virtual tour of different forest types that you can actually like walk through. So you can like click to follow kind of a trail, hear different birds in the habitat they're supposed to be in. And there's some little like fun, and you can click to learn how to manage them. So when that becomes available, I'll be sure to send it on to you guys so you have access to it, because it's a really neat tool, and they did a really good job with that. So for those of you who are not foresters, this part might be a little more interesting. So I mentioned I'm going to start really big. So if you have a lot of land and want to really dive into wildlife friendly management, start here, and then I'll work my way down to some of the basics that any landowner can do. So your local USDA, NRCS, or Soil and Water Office, they're awesome resources to really help you get your land, whether that's old farmland or anything like that, or a forest plot that you want to enroll in some of these conservation programs. They're really great tools. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I just wanted to mention that if you are interested in doing any sort of invasives removal or anything like that, EQIP can be a really good program to help provide some cost share dollars to help with some of the costs of removing invasives or things like that. For anybody, regardless of how much land you have, I really like this tool from the National Wildlife Federation. They have this certified wildlife habitat protocol. So what they do is you can go online and get your habitat certified as being a wildlife habitat. Your habitat should provide 3 types of food. So are you providing native plants? Are you providing nectar? Are you providing some fruit? And so it kind of walks you through. And so, if you can check those boxes, there's a small fee, and you can get like a little plaque that says this is certified wildlife habitat. So that's one option for using this resource, is to pay the fee, check some boxes, get your garden certified. The fee goes to support conservation resources. What I really like about this tool is kind of using this checklist as a guide for different management practices. So maybe an ideal wildlife habitat would check all or almost all of these boxes. So thinking about, okay, can I provide native plants and berries and nectar and foliage, and kind of go on through the list. And that can be really beneficial to think about, okay, this is what wildlife needs. They need food, water, shelter, places to raise their young, and then some of these sustainable practices as well. So thinking about using this checklist as a kind of a guide to help with some of your management practices. It's available for free online, nwweb.org/certified wildlife habitat. I really like that tool for kind of helping me narrow down, okay, what do I want to do in my property this year to provide a new aspect of wildlife habitat? Or option 3, you can do all of the above. You can get your property certified and use it as a guide to continually improve. What I really like about that resource is some of these sustainable practices that it mentions. So it talks about using soil and water conservation principles. So if you're able to capture rainwater from your roof instead of letting it run off into the streets where it's going to pick up pollution, debris, extra fertilizer from your lawns, you can capture it and then use that rainwater to irrigate your plants or something like that. Creating a landscape that thinks about how water is used in a sustainable way. Using a drip or a soaker hose for irrigation. So you're limiting water use, reducing erosion, cutting down on disease risk for some plants. Using a drip line is better to prevent issues like mold and mildew on some of your plants because that water isn't sitting on the leaves. Controlling exotic species. So I've mentioned integrated pest management. If anyone's not familiar with that concept, it's the idea of rather than reaching for the pesticide on your shelf first, think about what other ways you can manage to cut down on pest issues from the get-go, whether that's cultural control, so planting different plants, using different resources. I'll talk a little bit more about this as well, but essentially using native plants, removing non-natives, cutting down on lawns because lawns are not providing benefit to wildlife. Even replacing it with something like clover and violets is going to be infinitely better for something like a bumblebee. So this is an example of a xeriscape, which is water-wise landscaping. So this is a rain garden that I helped put in at Taylor University, and it helped capture water when it rains off the roof of their environmental science building. And then it helps slow the water down so that the plants are benefiting from that water in their roots. The water is staying in the soil there. And then only if there's an extreme, 2-inch rain, is it going to go into this culvert. So that's one way to kind of help cut down on some water runoff issues. If you have the ability to put in a rain garden, contact your local educator for a rainscaping course near you. It's a really good program. And then using native plants. So this is butterfly milkweed that I have in my garden. And we got to watch these there were actually two monarch caterpillars transform from giant caterpillar into their chrysalis. I sadly never saw the adult after it emerged, but they did great. My toddler loved coming out to see the caterpillars every day that they were there. Another option is to use some like sustainable agriculture techniques. So this is buckwheat in one of my garden beds, and it's a really good cover crop. So it's providing, this is late summer, so nothing was growing there. This was a new bed that I'm going to start planting again in the spring. But this is providing food for bees, which are going to in turn provide resources for the rest of the environment. Having some neighbor plants, so it's not just a monoculture of these native sunflowers. Using some of those sustainable agriculture techniques. Intercropping is a great one where you have, maybe something like tomatoes and marigolds next to each other, or tomatoes and I should have had my list of what intercrops really well, but if you search intercropping techniques, that's a really good way to increase diversity even in your garden beds. Yeah, so here's an example of intercropping. This is what's called a Three Sisters garden. So this is an indigenous gardening technique where corn, beans, and squash are all grown together, and they all support each other. The beans are legumes and they provide nitrogen to the corn. The squash, when it grows big, is going to shade out any weeds. And the corn is providing a stock for the beans as well. So it's a really good way to increase diversity just on this small garden plot, and kind of benefit the overall soil health and ecosystem, because you cut down on your need for things like pesticides when you're using some of these intercropping techniques that help kind of naturally cut down on predators. So how can Purdue Extension help? The whole point of this webinar series is to really benefit you guys as the general public and help connect Extension, county Extension to faculty Extension. And one of the ways that we do that is we have the Purdue Education Store. So if you go to this website, you can find so many free resources on everything from woodland stewardship to seed starting. I see a question in there about buckwheat, which is a great question. I'll come back to it at the end. But yeah, you can find information on cover crops in there and all of that. Contact your local educator. If you're here from Area 8 in Indiana, it's going to be Jeff, Courtney, Matthias, and myself, or contact your local office to find out who your agent is. And then finally, what if I don't have any trees, or what if I don't have resources to do some of these techniques? So I'm going to claim I'm a huge nerd. I love Tolkien. I love kind of his life philosophy. All we have to do is decide what to do with the time that is given us. And whether you have an entire forest that you can turn into a classified forest and make a wildlife refuge, or you have a single pot on your backyard, there are things that you can do to benefit birds at every scale. So I love sharing this list with people. It's a really good way to help bird populations regardless of what kind of scale you're operating on. So I've mentioned cats. Keep your cat indoors. It's better for the cat and for wildlife. I'm a cat person. My cat is much happier that I keep him inside. Cuts down on his risk of disease and injury. Yep, and cuts down on bird predation. Reflective stickers on windows and doors. So bird window collisions are a big source of mortality. So they make UV reflective stickers. I'm not supposed to promote any individual products, but if you search bird friendly or bird window collisions, you'll find all kinds of products that can really help. Some are prettier than others, but you can put them on your window and the birds see them, you don't, and it helps cut down on collisions. Another way to really help cut down on building collisions is to turn off any excess bright lights at night, unless you need it for safety, but turning off excess lights, especially during migration, which in this part of the world is April and May and September and October. So if you can turn off any bright lights at night, that can really help. It helps cut down on birds getting disoriented during migration as well, because they navigate using their eyes as well as the magnetic field of the earth. So any way we can cut down on some of that light pollution can be really beneficial. Again, using integrated pest management strategies, using some of your chemical pesticides as a last resort, planting native plants. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Bird-friendly coffee. I see someone in the chat is mentioning bird collision stickers from American Bird Conservancy. That's a great resource. Bird-friendly coffee. So a lot of our coffee, if you don't know, is grown in Central and South America, which is where a lot of our migratory birds go during the winter. Coffee plantations can either be, a monoculture of coffee trees, where the entire rainforest is cut down and you plant coffee trees in their place. So you have just coffee. Or what a lot of people are kind of shifting to and raising awareness of is leaving the rainforest canopy intact and planting coffee in the shade underneath some of those trees, which again leaves the forest canopy intact and still provides habitat for a lot of those birds. So if you search bird-friendly coffee, when we send out the follow-up email, I'll be sure to include a link to some resources about that. Bird-friendly coffee is coffee that has been grown in the shade under an existing forest canopy. So it's coffee that is, rather than removing the entire forest, still preserving some of it and providing habitat for some of our birds that go down to Central and South America in the winter. So in talks like this, take some water here. We tend to mention native plants a lot. Plant native, plant native, plant native, and that's great. And a lot of times we tend to just kind of gloss over why that's important. So I want to take just a couple minutes to kind of emphasize why planting native is so important, especially for our wildlife populations. It's because plants and insects co-evolve together. Plants in this part of the world and around the world were wind pollinated primarily until around 150 million years ago. And that's when insects became really some of the dominant life forms in the world and began to evolve and become more differentiated. And some of those insects discovered, oh, hey, pollen, that's a really good protein source. And so insects began to consume that as a protein source, which meant that the plants, I am completely anthropomorphizing here. Obviously, plants don't have sentience in the same way we do, so they're not thinking this verbally, but to kind of help frame it, the plants began to think, oh, if I provide more resources to help draw in those insects, they're consuming more pollen and spreading it across the landscape better. And that's helping me to reproduce more efficiently. So plants began to compete to get those insect visitors. Some plants added nectar as a reward to encourage insects to come visit. And this led to what's called an evolutionary arms race, and diversity just exploded. Insects began to diversify, plants began to diversify as they're competing to produce the brightest flower, provide the most pollen, provide the best resources to get their pollen across the landscape and help them reproduce the most efficiently. So today, nearly 500,000 plant species and over 200,000 animal species work together to pollinate flowers. Plants are getting the benefit of more efficient reproduction, increased genetic diversity, and insects are gaining valuable food and habitat. So there's a link here if you want to read more about kind of how that came about. But this coevolution, where these two groups evolve together and really benefit from being reciprocal members of the environment together. So when we talk about why we should plant native plants, it's because their pollinators co-evolved with those plants. So native species of bees and butterflies often specialize on native flowers, which is really important if you have a native bee species that you really want to protect. A lot of our native bee species are more efficient pollinators than honeybees. So if you want efficient pollination, especially if something like a squash, you're going to want to plant native plants because squash bees love having native plants around and pollinating your squashes. Yeah, I mentioned native pollinators are more efficient. Honeybees are native to Africa and Asia, kind of that part of the world. They're still really important pollinators. They're an important part of our agricultural system in this part of the world. But native pollinators are actually more efficient than honeybees, which I think is so fascinating. And you can protect threatened and endangered species through providing some of these native plants. So the monarch butterfly, which isn't on the endangered species list yet, to my knowledge, but I would not be surprised if it gets there in our lifetime. Other examples of some of these partnerships, monarch butterflies specialize on milkweed. So this means that sustainability is really important. Habitat restoration is going to be more possible by planting native plants. Indiana it used to be very prairie dominated and isn't as much now. So now there's only a few thousand acres of prairie. So by planting some of those prairie flowers, something like a cone flower, like milkweed, like New England aster and goldenrod, those are hugely beneficial for pollinators. And even if you can only plant it on a small scale, that's going to help restore some of that original habitat. Soil health, native plant roots tend to go much deeper than non-native plants, especially in the context of something like grass in the lawn, which I realize Jeff is on here, so I'm going to shut up about turf. But thinking about native plant roots tend to go a lot deeper, and they help to stabilize the soil, maintain healthier seed banks, so you're cutting down on weeds and things like that. And then it helps protect our water resources as well. So native plants tend to require less water, and they help cut down on erosion. So then just to kind of wrap up a few tools that I love, the Indiana Native Plant Society, it has this great plant finder tool to help, like maybe you have a space where you want to plant a tree or a sedge or something like that. And you can really narrow it down by the amount of light they require, how much moisture, season they need, etc. So that's a really great tool. They have all kinds of resources on their website. So awesome resource there. The Merlin Bird ID app. This is a free app from the App Store or Google Play. The only catch is it takes up a lot of space on your phone. So if you're limited on space, that's the one downside. But it's an awesome resource to help you identify what you're seeing and hearing. It works like Shazam, if you're familiar with that, like to help you identify what you're hearing. So you can record a bird song and it'll tell you what's singing, or you can kind of walk through, like, I saw this bird, it was about this big, this color, in this habitat, what was it? And it'll really help you identify what birds you're seeing. So if I was to recommend only one app, it's this one. If you're interested in really diving into other tools, Seek by iNaturalist, or just the iNaturalist app in general. These are other awesome tools. Seek by iNaturalist helps you identify species, not just birds. So if there's an insect you want to identify, or a plant or something like that, this app, it's a free resource. It's got a camera with some AI tools in it, so it can help say, like, okay, I'm seeing, as you're holding the phone up to this insect, I think it's a monarch butterfly. Yeah, so that's a really great tool. It's free as well. It just requires some internet access, basically. Yeah, I kind of talked about a lot of this. I realize I'm cutting it close on time. The last thing I want to kind of mention, native plants are host to good bugs down here. If you can only plant one thing, that's a question I've gotten a few times. I want to plant one thing that's going to really help birds. Plant a white oak tree. A white oak tree is host to, I'm going to get the number wrong, but on the order of hundreds, if not thousands, of native insects, especially caterpillars. Doug Tallamy has an excellent book. It's called The Nature of Oaks. That's an awesome resource to really talk about the benefit of oaks for wildlife species. So if you can only plant one tree, plant an oak. They're such awesome trees and provide really good food resources in the form of providing that habitat for the insects that the birds then need. Yeah, again, just to emphasize, create diversity in your habitats, small to large. So lawn weeds all the way up to trees. A weed is only a weed if you want it to be a weed. So in my lawn, I have violets and clover and dandelions growing because I like seeing them in the lawn, and the bumblebees love them. You know, if you want that classic manicured green lawn, that's going to be a different conversation. But for me, dandelions and clover aren't weeds. So it's just a matter of perspective there. If you're developing a, if you're developing a flower garden, having a diversity of blooms is going to benefit a lot of organisms. So different flower shapes, colors throughout the time of year, all of that. So ideally, you would have a variety of blooming plants throughout the growing season. If anyone wants to chat about bird feeders, yeah, I tend to like providing a variety of feeders from suet to sunflower seed to fruit and hummingbird nectar. The main point here is don't use the red dye hummingbird nectar because that can be toxic to birds. Just a 1 to 4 sugar to water ratio is perfect for them. I tend to relax during the summer for bird feeding just because that's the breeding season and a lot of birds switch insects primarily at that point of the year anyways. But yeah, during the spring, fall, winter, providing food, just make sure that you are either putting your feeders right next to a window or at least 30 feet away, just to cut down on risk of building collisions or predators hiding in shrubs near buildings or anything like that. Yeah, with that, I think I went over on time a little bit, but I think we have a few minutes for questions. So.
All right. Do we have any questions? Feel free to go ahead and put them in the chat there, or if you're comfortable, we'll give you a few minutes here to unmute and go ahead and talk.
Yep. Yeah, so I see one question in here. When should buckwheat be seeded in Northeast Indiana for monarch fall migration? I am not positive on the timing of that. I'm not sure if Matthias, Jeff, or Courtney, or anyone, if you have thoughts on that.
I don't have any thoughts on that one. That is something we can do a little bit of research in and get back to you on.
Yeah, I was kind of leaning towards late summer. Sounds about right. I know that's when I planted mine. But yeah, for monarch migration specifically, I'm not positive. So yeah. Yeah, if anyone is in the South Bend area, Doug Talmy, whose book I mentioned, he's going to be speaking at their Audubon group on September 15. So I'll try to find that information and have it sent out in the email for you all as well.
Okay. Any other questions? Well, seeing none, Jessica, I want to thank you for pinch hitting today and
Yeah, thank you.
kind of filling in for us. Feel free to share that registration link with other people. We'd love to have more participants. I think we had 21, 20, or 27 on here today at one point in time. We'd love to be able to reach out and help educate others. So feel free to share that registration link with others. Be looking for an email. It'll probably come from Courtney about all the links and all the things that we talked about here today. And Jeff, do you have anything else you want to add before we sign off here?
We're doing okay. Sorry, I was kind of working on some mechanical issues here. But I guess we can stop recording. Look for those emails from Courtney, and then yes, for those who are